An American Family is such a brilliant episode of Cheers, and it has such an amazing moment in it. There's this one scene that just had me howling with laughter, and I will, of course, discuss that in more detail in a moment. There's also something Diane said, and I can't work out if it's a slip of the tongue or sarcasm. So I'd love to know if anybody else has any opinions on that. And again, I'll discuss that in a moment. There will be spoilers from this point on as I go into quite a bit of detail about the episode. This is the 9th episode of the 3rd season of Cheers, directed, of course, by the wonderful James Burrows, and the main narrative focuses on the fact that Nick, Carla's ex-husband, wants one of her children, well, one of their children, because it turns out Loretta can't have kids of her own, and he wants to come across as a family man, so he wants custody of one of their children. And I'll talk more about that part of the narrative in a moment, but first of all, let's start from the beginning. The opening scene actually isn't that great. It's okay, but it felt really abrupt. It felt like it ended like it wasn't finished, like we needed a couple of more seconds, a couple more lines. It does feel like it ends abruptly, but they do come back to it later on, and that is the scene that I absolutely adored. It's the scene where Cliff comes into the bar with this book, and he wins the bet. But then Norm also wins a bet because he'd bet with Coach that Cliff would be really annoying about it, which I absolutely found hilarious. And then they're all laughing and cry laughing, and it's just absolutely fantastic. Particularly Coach. Coach has such an amazing laugh. And then Coach reveals something, and this is the point where I really started to find this hysterical. When Coach reveals that Cliff spent $30 on a book to win a $20 bet, which is a very Cliff thing to do, to prove himself right, to spend more money than he'd win. And it's fantastic, and that whole scene is just so hilarious. And then when Diane says, "Are you ever pleased with each other's good fortune?" and Norm replies, "Who's had it?" And it just goes from strength to strength, and I found it to be very well written. The performances are brilliant, the timing is impeccable, very, very funny. Another subplot, which doesn't take up too much time but is quite thought-provoking, is that Sam is going to the Pequod with another girl, another woman, and it turns out he'd taken Diane there, and Diane puts the thought in his head that actually maybe he shouldn't be there with another woman, even though she doesn't care. She brushes it off. I think deep down she probably does care. But it's interesting how that part of it played out. But Diane said something, and as I said at the beginning, I don't know if it was Diane, well, a slip of the tongue, or if she was being sarcastic, and it's when she said, "I could care less." Obviously, the saying is, "I couldn't care less," but I can't work out if it was just a badly written bit of dialogue, or if she was being sarcastic. It didn't really come across as sarcasm with her saying, "I could care less," as sarcasm. It didn't come across as that, but I find it difficult to believe that Diane would get that incorrect. So I'd love to know if anybody has any thoughts on that. Do you think she's being sarcastic? Is it just a badly written bit of dialogue? I feel like somebody would have picked up on that. So I don't know. I'm not decided about how I feel about it, but it's just something that I observed. But the Pequod aspect of the narrative, I thought played out quite well, and definitely provides some food for thought about how Sam reflects on the time he spent with Diane. The main narrative, as I said, focuses on Carla, determined to not sign the papers, confident that she doesn't want to give away one of her children, basically, but she seems to fall under Nick's charm whenever they're alone. And I love how everybody was there to support her, everybody in the bar. And one of my favourite scenes, another moment that I absolutely loved, was when everybody's got their eyes closed, sending positive energy, positive mental energy, and it's silent. And then Norm stands up to help himself to some beer, and Sam calls him Norman, which I love, because usually it's only Diane who calls him Norman, and I just found it to be very, very delightful. There's a lot of comedy in this. It is such a funny episode. I think Rhea Perlman gave an amazing performance, and it's quite an intense episode because it's very unclear, I think, where it's going and ultimately what's going to happen. I think Loretta was very unpredictable. Jean Kasem gives a great performance as Loretta, of course, and when she when she stood up to Nick and said, "No, you can't do this to Carla, to a fellow woman, to a mother. You can't do this to her." I was really proud of her. She's not a. I don't want to say I don't like her as a character because I think she's a very well written, well performed character. She's very interesting, but in terms of her personality, she's maybe not the most easy to like. But I was really pleased with what she did here. I also have to say, Dan Hedaya as Nick, his performance, the way he carries himself as Nick is just brilliant. And he always gives off this really sleazy, slimy quality that really comes across in the performance. And it's just absolutely brilliant to watch. Unnerving, but brilliant. The performances across the board in this episode were just top level, absolutely fantastic. The comedy, it just hit every single time. The pacing of the narrative is brilliant. The only thing that I think didn't work, as I said, was the beginning, the intro. It felt abrupt. Thankfully, we did come back to it. But at the time, it certainly felt very abrupt. And the whole Diane saying I could care less. I wish I could ask. I wish I could ask the writers. This particular episode was written by Heide Perlman. Did they mean for it to be sarcasm? Or was it just a slip of the tongue or a slip of the pen, I guess, if it wasn't meant to be written like that? I'd love to know because it's going to irritate me more than it should do. So I'd love to know if anybody has any particular opinions on how they perceive that. But either way, it's a tiny thing. It doesn't affect my overall enjoyment of the episode. An American Family is absolutely fantastic. It's hilarious. The performances are amazing. It's an unpredictable narrative, almost start to finish. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. A pretty fantastic episode, all things considered.